It started as a day like any other for Shaquille O'Neal. The towering basketball legend, now a successful businessman and global personality, had grown used to a life that few could imagine. Cameras followed him wherever he went, crowds erupted into cheers when he appeared, and doors opened for him effortlessly. But today, there was no adoring crowd, no flashing cameras, just a quiet, private airport where he planned to board a jet for an important meeting across the country. Shaq's schedule was tight. As always, his days were packed with commitments, corporate deals, charity events, and personal projects. He thrived on the fast pace, moving seamlessly from one role to another. That morning, he'd wrapped up a phone call with his financial advisor, signed off on a community outreach program, and now, he was ready to catch his flight. His focus was laser sharp, his stride confident as he approached the sleek, glass doors of the terminal. To most people, it might have seemed like an ordinary moment in the life of a busy man. But there was something about this day, something small, almost imperceptible, that made it different. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight glinted off the runway or the unusual stillness in the air. Shaq didn't notice it at first, but soon, he would. As he stepped inside the terminal, Shaq greeted the staff warmly, as he always did. His deep voice carried a friendliness that immediately put people at ease. "Morning, folks," he said, flashing his trademark grin. A couple of workers exchanged glances, their eyes lighting up with recognition. They whispered to each other, excitement barely contained. But not everyone was smiling. Near the security checkpoint stood a guard, tall and stern, his uniform crisp and spotless. His arms were crossed, his stance rigid. As Shaq approached, the guard didn't move aside or greet him like the others. Instead, he stepped forward, blocking the path. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hardness in his eyes. "Hold on," the guard said, his voice firm. "You can't go through without proper clearance." Shaq stopped in his tracks, surprised but not rattled. He was used to being recognized instantly, not because of arrogance, but because his presence was hard to miss. At 7 feet tall, with a physique that still hinted at his days of dominating the basketball court, Shaq was larger than life in every sense of the word. Add to that his fame and personality, and it was rare for anyone not to know who he was. "Excuse me?" Shaq asked, his tone polite but puzzled. "You heard me," the guard replied, his gaze unwavering. "I need to see some ID." For a moment, Shaq hesitated. He wasn't one to pull the "do you know who I am" card. In fact, he often went out of his way to stay humble and approachable, even with his larger-than-life status. But this felt different. The guard's tone wasn't just about following procedure, it carried an edge, a subtle challenge that Shaq couldn't ignore. Still, Shaq tried to brush it off with his usual humor. "ID? Man, my face is my ID," he joked, flashing another smile. He expected the guard to laugh or at least crack a smile. Instead, the man's expression remained stony. "Rules are rules," the guard said curtly. "If you don't have proper clearance, you're not going through." Shaq's smile faded slightly. He could feel the weight of the guard's gaze, not just looking at him, but through him, as if trying to strip away everything that made him who he was. It wasn't the first time Shaq had felt this kind of scrutiny. Despite all his achievements, there were still moments, rare but unforgettable, when people judged him not for his character or accomplishments, but for something as superficial as the color of his skin. The staff nearby began to fidget, sensing the tension. One of them, a young woman with a clipboard, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," she began, addressing the guard, "I think you should." The guard raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm handling this," he said sharply, his eyes never leaving Shaq. Shaq took a deep breath, keeping his composure. He wasn't angry, not yet. Years of experience had taught him the value of staying calm in situations like this. but there was a part of him, a small, stubborn part, that bristled at the unfairness of it all. He was here for a simple flight, nothing more. Why was he being treated like a suspect instead of a respected customer? "All right," Shaq said evenly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, producing his ID. "Here you go." The guard snatched it without a word, his eyes scanning the card as if he expected it to be fake. After a long pause, he handed it back, his expression unchanged. "Doesn't prove anything," he muttered under his breath. Shaq's eyebrows raised slightly. "Doesn't prove anything," he repeated, his voice still calm but with an unmistakable edge. "You've got my name, my face, and my ID right in front of you. What more do you need?" The guard didn't answer. Instead, he glanced around, as if looking for backup, but the other staff members were frozen, unsure of what to do. The young woman with the clipboard tried again, her voice firmer this time. "Sir, this is Shaquille O'Neal. He's—" "I know who he is," the guard snapped, cutting her off again. The room went silent. Even Shaq was momentarily taken aback. The guard's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. If he knew who Shaq was, then this wasn't about identification or protocol. It was about something else entirely, something that Shaq recognized all too well. He stood there for a moment, his massive frame towering over the guard but his demeanor calm and controlled. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the terminal on him, waiting to see how he would react. Years ago, a younger Shaq might have let his frustration show. But now, he was older, wiser, and more determined to rise above situations like this. "All right," Shaq said finally, his voice low but steady. "If this is how you want to play it, fine. Let's call your manager and sort this out." The guard hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. But he didn't back down. "Fine," he said stiffly. "Wait here." As the guard walked away, Shaq couldn't help but shake his head. It was just another reminder that, no matter how much success he achieved or how far he came, there would always be moments when people tried to diminish him. But Shaq wasn't about to let this one moment define his day or him. What the guard didn't realize was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. And Shaq? He was about to remind everyone in the room exactly why he was more than just a legend. He was a man who commanded respect, no matter where he went. As Shaq stood there, the bustling activity of the terminal seemed to pause. The young woman with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably, her hands clutching the edge of her notes. She looked as though she wanted to intervene again but held herself back, wary of overstepping. Behind her, a handful of other staff members were whispering to each other, their eyes darting nervously between Shaq and the retreating guard. Shaq folded his arms across his broad chest and took a slow, calming breath. He had faced moments like this before, though not often in recent years. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce him to less than he was, to look past his achievements, his humanity, and see only their own biases. But each time it happened, it left a familiar sting. He thought of the years he'd spent proving himself on the court, the hours of sweat and hard work, the late nights spent building his businesses. He thought of the kids who looked up to him, the fans who called him a hero. What would they say if they saw him now? Not the towering icon they cheered for, but a man being held back as though he were just another nameless face. Shaq clenched his jaw but forced himself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help him here, it never did. Instead, he glanced around the room. The staff were avoiding his gaze, their discomfort almost palpable. But there was no mistaking the recognition in their eyes. They knew who he was. Even those who weren't basketball fans would have seen him on TV or in the countless commercials he'd done. His name alone carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Yet, the silence told him something else. They didn't know what to do. They were waiting, hoping someone else would take charge and resolve the tension. Shaq's eyes softened. He'd been in their shoes before, not in this exact way, but he understood what it felt like to be caught in a moment of awkwardness, unsure of how to act. He gave them a small, reassuring nod, as if to say, "It's okay. I've got this." A couple of them seemed to relax, their shoulders loosening as they exchanged hopeful glances. Still, no one moved. The seconds ticked by, stretching into what felt like minutes. The guard had disappeared around the corner, presumably to fetch his superior. Shaq considered following him, but he decided against it. This wasn't a situation where he needed to chase after anyone. The truth would come out soon enough. Nearby, a father and his young son were seated in one of the terminal's waiting areas. The boy, no older than 10, was staring at Shaq with wide, curious eyes. He tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered something. The father leaned down to listen, then glanced up, his expression shifting from surprise to embarrassment. He quickly hushed his son and tried to redirect his attention, but the boy wasn't having it. "Dad," the boy said, louder this time. "That's Shaquille O'Neal. Can I say hi?" Shaq heard him and turned, his stern expression melting into a warm smile. He gave the boy a friendly wave, his massive hand dwarfing the motion. The boy beamed, his excitement contagious. "Hi, Mr. O'Neal," he called out, his voice ringing through the quiet terminal. Shaq chuckled and nodded. "Hey there, little man," he replied, his deep voice carrying a note of playfulness. "You doing all right?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, his shyness forgotten. "I saw you play on TV. You're really good." "Thanks, buddy," Shaq said, his grin widening. "You play basketball too?" The boy's face lit up. "Yeah. I'm not as tall as you, though." Shaq laughed, a rich, hearty sound that seemed to break the tension in the room. "Don't worry, big things start small. Keep practicing, and who knows, you might be dunking on people someday." The boy's father smiled, his earlier embarrassment replaced with gratitude. "Thanks for that," he said, nodding toward Shaq. "You made his day." Shaq waved it off. "It's nothing. Kids are what it's all about." The brief interaction reminded everyone in the terminal of who Shaq really was, a larger-than-life figure who never forgot where he came from. It was a moment of lightness, a reprieve from the awkwardness hanging over the scene. But then the guard returned, and the atmosphere shifted again. He wasn't alone this time. Following closely behind him was a man in a suit, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. He looked to be in his late 40s, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. The way he carried himself suggested he was someone important, likely the terminal manager or a higher-ranking official. His eyes darted toward Shaq as he approached, his pace quickening when he realized who was standing there. "Mr. O'Neal," the man said, his tone hurried but apologetic. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. I had no idea you were here." The guard, standing just behind him, stiffened but didn't say anything. His earlier confidence seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a subtle but unmistakable unease. Shaq didn't reply immediately. He let the man's words hang in the air for a moment before responding, his voice calm but firm. "It's not about me being here. It's about why this happened in the first place." The manager nodded, clearly flustered. "You're absolutely right, sir. This is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Will it?" he asked, his tone even but pointed. "Because from where I'm standing, this isn't just about a misunderstanding. This is about respect or the lack of it." The manager swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable under Shaq's steady gaze. He turned to the guard, his expression stern. "Is this true? Did you know who Mr. O'Neal was?" The guard hesitated, his eyes darting between Shaq and the manager. For a moment, it looked as though he might deny it, but the weight of the situation was too much. I thought I was following protocol," he said weakly, his earlier defiance now replaced with uncertainty. "Protocol," Shaq repeated, his voice low but powerful. "Let me ask you something. Would you have questioned someone else the same way if they looked different? If they didn't look like me?" The room fell silent again. The guard opened his mouth to respond but closed it just as quickly, unable to find the words. Shaq sighed, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Listen," he said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm not here to make a scene. But this kind of thing? It happens too often. And it needs to stop." The manager nodded vigorously. "You're absolutely right, sir. I can't apologize enough. This will be handled, I promise." Shaq studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good," he said simply. The manager turned to the guard. "You're dismissed," he said sharply. "I'll deal with you later." The guard hesitated, as if about to protest, but then thought better of it. He turned and walked away, his step slower and less confident than before. As the situation finally resolved, Shaq felt a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and a lingering sense of unease. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he turned back to the young boy, who was still watching him with wide eyes. "Stay out of trouble, little man," Shaq said with a wink. The boy grinned and gave him a thumbs up. With that, Shaq made his way toward the jet, his stride confident once again. But as he boarded the plane, he couldn't shake the thought that moments like this were a reminder of how far the world still had to go. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of a story that would leave everyone in that terminal questioning their assumptions and change the guard's life forever. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Shaquille O'Neal, a man whose presence was as undeniable as his legacy, stood before the security guard, his towering frame calm yet commanding. But it wasn't enough. The guard's rigid stance and cold expression made it clear that this wasn't just about following protocol, it was personal. The guard's words carried a sharpness that cut through the polite murmurs of the terminal staff. "I don't care who you say you are," he said, his voice laced with a tone that felt less like professionalism and more like defiance. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze unflinching as he stared up at Shaq. Behind them, the staff exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them recognized Shaq immediately, their whispered conversations and wide-eyed stares betraying their excitement. Yet, no one stepped forward. It was as if the scene unfolding before them was too fragile, too precarious to interrupt. Shaq met the guard's gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the weight of the silence to settle. He wasn't the type to lose his temper or lash out. Years of being in the public eye had taught him the importance of staying composed, even when the situation felt deeply unfair. But beneath his calm exterior, there was a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, the sting of prejudice. He straightened his posture, his deep voice steady but firm. "Call your manager," Shaq said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. The guard, however, didn't move. If anything, his stance grew more resolute, as if Shaq's calm authority only fueled his determination to hold his ground. "Not until you show me proof," the guard retorted, his tone sharp and dismissive. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his patience thinning. "Proof," he repeated, his voice carrying just the slightest edge. "Proof of what, exactly?" The guard didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over Shaq's shoulder, as though searching for support from the nearby staff. But none came. The workers remained rooted in place, their faces a mix of apprehension and quiet disbelief. "Proof that you belong here," the guard said finally, his words deliberate and cutting. "I don't care who you think you are. I need to see proper credentials." Proper credentials. The phrase echoed in Shaq's mind, heavy with implication. He'd provided his ID earlier, and it had been more than sufficient. But now, it seemed, even that wasn't enough. The guard's insistence wasn't about protocol, it was about power. Shaq took a slow, measured breath. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting to see how he would react. A younger version of himself might have bristled at the disrespect, might have let his frustration boil over. But Shaq was no longer that man. He had learned to choose his battles, to rise above situations designed to provoke. Still, he couldn't ignore the injustice of it all. "I've already given you my ID," Shaq said evenly, his voice low but resonant. "What more do you need?" The guard didn't flinch. "Your ID doesn't prove anything," he said bluntly. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Doesn't prove anything," he echoed. There was a pause, a moment of stillness that felt charged with unspoken tension. "My name is on that ID. My face is on that ID. What exactly doesn't it prove?" The guard's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. He seemed to sense that Shaq's questions weren't just rhetorical, they were a direct challenge to his authority. And yet, he didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down, his tone growing colder. "Rules are rules," he said flatly. "If you don't have the proper paperwork, you're not going through. End of story." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Shaq's eyes flicked briefly to the young woman with the clipboard, who had stepped forward earlier in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. She looked as though she wanted to speak up again, but the guard's unwavering demeanor held her back. Shaq turned his attention back to the guard, his gaze steady. "Let me ask you something," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "If I looked different, if I didn't look like me, would you be asking for the same proof?" The question landed like a thunderclap. The room, already quiet, seemed to grow even more still. The guard's eyes flickered, a brief flash of uncertainty breaking through his stern facade. But he quickly masked it, his expression hardening once more. "I don't know what you're talking about," the guard said, his tone defensive. "I treat everyone the same." Shaq's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Do you?" he asked softly. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just a quiet challenge that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. The guard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he turned away abruptly, muttering something under his breath. "Wait here," he said over his shoulder. "I'm calling my supervisor." As the guard walked off, Shaq let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but it shifted, the focus now on what would happen next. The young woman with the clipboard hesitated, then stepped closer to Shaq. "I'm so sorry about this," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried to step in earlier, but..." Shaq held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "It's all right," he said, his tone kind but firm. "This isn't on you." The woman nodded, her cheeks flushing with a mix of relief and embarrassment. I don't understand why he's acting like this," she murmured. "Everyone knows who you are." Shaq gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not everyone wants to see what's right in front of them," he said simply. The woman blinked, her expression thoughtful, as though Shaq's words had struck a chord. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. The guard was returning, and this time, he wasn't alone. A man in a sharp suit accompanied him, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. As they approached, the man's eyes locked onto Shaq, widening slightly in recognition. He quickened his pace, moving ahead of the guard. "Mr. O'Neill," the man said, his tone apologetic. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. I had no idea you were here." Shaq didn't reply immediately. He watched as the man turned to the guard, his expression hardening. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Do you realize who this is?" The guard's confidence wavered, but he didn't back down entirely. I was just following protocol, he said stiffly. I needed to verify his credentials. The man in the suit frowned. You needed to verify Shaquille O'Neal's credentials, he asked incredulously. Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds? The guard shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. Shaq finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. It's not about the credentials, he said. It's about respect. The man in the suit nodded, his expression somber. You're absolutely right, sir. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed. Shaq studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good, he said simply. But as the conversation unfolded, one thing became clear, this wasn't over yet. The man in the suit, evidently the terminal supervisor, turned to the guard, his expression sharp. I need you to step aside, he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Right now. The guard hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced back at Shaq. His face was a mixture of defiance and discomfort, as if he realized the situation had spun out of his control but was too stubborn to admit it. Slowly, he uncrossed his arms, stepping back a half step. But even as he moved, there was a lingering air of resentment in the way he held himself, his shoulders stiff and his lips pressed into a thin line. The supervisor turned back to Shaq, his expression softening. Again, I want to apologize, Mr. O'Neal, he said, his voice steady but remorseful. This should never have happened. Shaq gave him a curt nod, his face unreadable. It's not just about the apology, he said, his tone calm but firm. It's about understanding why it happened in the first place. The supervisor blinked, caught off guard by Shaq's response. He opened his mouth to speak, but Shaq wasn't finished. I'm a patient man, Shaq continued, his voice measured. I've learned to deal with situations like this over the years. But let's not pretend this is just a misunderstanding. There's something deeper going on here, something that can't be fixed with a simple I'm sorry. The room was silent again, the weight of Shaq's words hanging heavy in the air. The staff who had been watching from the sidelines now looked down, some shuffling awkwardly on their feet. The young woman with the clipboard clutched it tighter, her knuckles white as if trying to steady herself. The supervisor cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. You're absolutely right, sir, he said finally. This behavior is unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the values we uphold here. I'll personally ensure that. Shaq raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. It's not just about ensuring it doesn't happen again, he said. It's about making people think. Making them question why they act the way they do, why they make certain assumptions. That's the only way things will ever really change. The supervisor nodded, his expression earnest. Understood, sir, he said. I'll take full responsibility for addressing this. Shaq studied him for a moment, his deep brown eyes searching for something authenticity, perhaps, or a genuine commitment to follow through. Finally, he nodded again, a small but significant gesture. The supervisor exhaled quietly, relief washing over his face. He turned back to the guard, his demeanor shifting instantly. We'll have a conversation later, he said, his tone clipped. For now, you're relieved of your post. Leave the terminal immediately. The guard's face flushed red, a mix of anger and humiliation. I was just doing my job, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Doing your job, the supervisor repeated, his tone cold. Is that what you call this? You weren't following protocol, you were letting your biases dictate your actions. And now, you're facing the consequences. The guard opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing loudly against the tiled floor. The tension in the room eased slightly with his departure, but the underlying discomfort remained, like a faint hum just beneath the surface. As the guard disappeared through a side door, Shaq turned his attention to the bystanders who had been watching the entire ordeal. Some of them met his gaze, their expressions apologetic or sympathetic, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. The young boy who had called out to Shaq earlier was still watching him intently, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. He tugged on his father's sleeve again, whispering something. This time, his father leaned down and listened, his face softening as his son spoke. "Excuse me, Mr. O'Neill," the father said, standing up and approaching Shaq cautiously. "My son has a question, if you don't mind." Shaq's serious expression softened instantly. He crouched slightly to bring himself closer to the boy's height, a warm smile spreading across his face. "What's up, little man?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, glancing at his father for reassurance before looking back at Shaq. "Why was that man so mean to you?" he asked, his voice small but earnest. The question hit Shaq harder than he expected. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. How do you explain prejudice to a child without dimming their innocent view of the world? Shaq took a deep breath, his smile never wavering. "Sometimes, people make mistakes," he said carefully. "They see someone and think they know who they are just by looking at them. But it's not right, and it's not fair. That's why it's important to always treat people with respect, no matter what." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his young mind processing Shaq's words. "Okay," he said after a moment. "I'll remember that." Shaq's smile widened, and he reached out to gently ruffle the boy's hair. "Good man," he said. "You're gonna make the world a better place." The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, giving Shaq a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Shaq stood up, his towering frame once again commanding the room. The father and son returned to their seats, and the rest of the terminal staff slowly began to disperse, the earlier tension giving way to a tentative sense of normalcy. The young woman with the clipboard approached Shaq hesitantly. "Mr. O'Neill," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say, thank you for handling that the way you did." Shaq looked at her, his expression kind. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "We all have a role to play in moments like this. It's about standing up for what's right." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're right," she said softly. "I'll remember that." As Shaq turned to finally board his jet, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. The anger and frustration from the encounter lingered, but so did a sense of hope. The boy's question, the woman's gratitude, even the supervisor's attempt to make things right, it all pointed to the possibility of change. But as he settled into his seat on the plane, Shaq knew that change wouldn't come easily. It never did. Moments like these were just small battles in a much larger fight, a fight for respect, for understanding, for equality. And Shaquille O'Neal, ever the gentle giant, was ready to keep fighting. The room's energy shifted, the tension palpable as Shaq, ever composed, remained steady in the face of mounting resistance. His towering frame seemed almost relaxed, but his eyes betrayed a quiet determination. The security guard, still rigid and defiant, stood his ground, his chin raised as though he had something to prove. Shaq tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. He leaned forward just enough to bridge the distance between them, his deep voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "You know who I am," he said softly, the hint of amusement in his tone catching the guard off guard. The guard scoffed, his bravado barely masking his growing unease. "Doesn't matter," he said with a shrug, his voice louder than it needed to be, as if volume could strengthen his resolve. "Rules are rules." Shaq straightened back up, his gaze steady. He didn't need to argue or raise his voice. Years of navigating situations like this had taught him that silence could speak louder than words. And so, he let the moment stretch, the weight of his presence filling the room. Behind them, the murmurs of the airport staff grew louder. Whispers floated through the air, some incredulous, others alarmed. A young man near the check-in counter fumbled with a clipboard, his hands shaking slightly as he muttered, "That's Shaquille O'Neal. What is he doing?" Another staff member, a middle-aged woman with a crisp uniform and a no-nonsense demeanor, pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she frantically typed a message. One brave staff member, a petite woman in her 20s, finally stepped forward, her wide eyes darting between Shaq and the guard. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice hesitant but earnest. That's Mr. O'Neal. He's..." "Enough," the guard barked, cutting her off with a sharp wave of his hand. His face reddened as he turned back to Shaq, his jaw tightening. "I don't care who you are," he said, his tone now laced with frustration. "If you don't have the right papers, you're not getting through." Shaq didn't flinch. He had seen this before, this need to assert control, to cling to authority in the face of someone larger, both literally and figuratively. He let the guard's words hang in the air for a beat before pulling out his phone. With a few quick taps, he placed a call, holding the device up to his ear. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I need a favor. Right now." The room seemed to hold its breath as Shaq spoke. He didn't raise his voice or elaborate further, but the tone of quiet confidence in his words carried weight. Whatever he was planning, it was clear that he wasn't going to let the situation escalate on the guard's terms. The guard shifted on his feet, his confidence faltering slightly as he watched Shaq. He glanced over his shoulder at the growing cluster of staff members, some of whom were now openly gawking, their phones in hand. A few had begun recording, the tiny red lights on their devices blinking ominously. Shaq ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Help's on the way," he said simply, his tone neutral. But the way he said it, calm, deliberate, was enough to make the guard hesitate. Behind them, the young woman with the clipboard approached Shaq once more, her expression a mix of apology and fear. "Mr. O'Neal, I'm so sorry about this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "We're trying to sort everything out." Shaq looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "It's not your fault," he said gently. "Just do what you need to do." She nodded quickly, retreating a few steps but staying close enough to intervene if needed. Meanwhile, the supervisor, who had spoken to Shaq earlier, was now pacing near the back of the terminal, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders into it. Whatever he was arranging, it was clear that the situation had reached the upper levels of management. As the minutes ticked by, the room seemed to pulse with anticipation. Shaq remained a steady presence, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos swirling around him. The guard, however, was beginning to crack. His posture stiffened further, his shoulders squared as he tried to maintain his composure. But the nervous glances he shot toward the staff, and the subtle twitch of his fingers, betrayed his growing uncertainty. Then, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Two men in sharp suits appeared at the edge of the terminal, their expressions grim. One of them, tall with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene before locking onto Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal," the man said, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm the regional manager for this terminal. I want to personally apologize for this situation." The guard opened his mouth to protest, but the regional manager silenced him with a raised hand. "We'll speak later," he said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Shaq acknowledged the man with a small nod. "Appreciate that," he said simply. The regional manager turned to the guard, his expression hard. "You've been briefed on protocol for handling high-profile guests," he said, his tone biting. "This behavior is unacceptable." The guard shifted uncomfortably, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the reprimand. "I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly. "No, the regional manager snapped. Your job is to ensure security while treating every passenger with respect. What you've done here is beyond inexcusable. As the regional manager continued to address the guard, Shaq's attention shifted to the staff members who had been watching from the sidelines. Some of them looked embarrassed, others relieved that the situation was finally being resolved. But one thing was clear, everyone in the room had learned something that day. A second man in a suit, who had been standing silently next to the regional manager, approached Shaq. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter but no less serious. "We've cleared everything on our end. You're free to board whenever you're ready." Shaq studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said. As he began to move toward the private jet waiting on the tarmac, he paused, glancing back at the guard. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. There was no malice in Shaq's gaze, only a quiet resolve. "Next time," Shaq said, his voice low but carrying across the room, "think before you act." With that, he turned and walked away, his long strides purposeful. The crowd parted for him as he moved, the staff watching him with a mixture of admiration and regret. Behind him, the regional manager continued to address the guard, his tone firm and unyielding. As Shaq boarded the plane, he couldn't help but reflect on the events of the morning. It wasn't just about him, it never had been. It was about something bigger, something deeper. Moments like these were reminders of how far there was still to go, but also of how important it was to keep pushing forward. And Shaquille O'Neal, with his quiet strength and unshakable resolve, was ready to do just that. The private jet gleamed under the bright morning sun, waiting patiently on the tarmac like a sentinel. The sight was a stark contrast to the scene unfolding inside the terminal, where emotions still simmered just below the surface. Shaq's footsteps were deliberate as he approached the boarding gate, but his thoughts churned with the memory of what had just transpired. He paused at the entrance, his broad frame blocking the light streaming in from the glass walls behind him. The whispers of the staff, the scattered apologies, the young boy's innocent question, all of it lingered in his mind. He could feel the weight of their gazes on his back, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and guilt. Turning slightly, Shaq looked back over his shoulder. The guard was still there, standing stiffly as the regional manager continued his stern lecture. The man's shoulders sagged under the weight of his mistake, but his eyes carried something else: resentment. It was subtle, a flicker of anger buried beneath his downcast expression, but Shaq caught it. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who wasn't sorry for their actions, only for the consequences. Shaq sighed quietly, shaking his head. He could confront the man, push harder for an acknowledgement of what had truly happened, but what would be the point? People like that didn't change overnight. They needed to be shown, to experience the consequences of their behavior in ways that went beyond words. Behind him, the young woman with the clipboard was still watching, her expression a mix of guilt and resolve. Shaq turned fully, walking back toward her with calm, measured steps. She straightened up as he approached, clutching the clipboard like a lifeline. "You okay?" Shaq asked, his voice low but kind. She nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, sir," she said. I wanted to apologize again. For not stepping in sooner." Shaq studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "It's not easy to step up," he said. "Especially in a situation like that. But it's important. You saw what was happening, you knew it wasn't right. That's the first step." The woman swallowed hard, nodding again. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll remember that." Shaq gave her a small smile before stepping past her, heading back toward the gate. As he reached the door, the regional manager broke away from the guard and hurried over, his face a mixture of relief and determination. "Mr. O'Neal," the manager began, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. "I want to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously. The guard will be placed on immediate suspension, and will be conducting a thorough review of our training and protocols. Shaq turned to face him fully, his expression unreadable. It's not just about suspensions or reviews, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's about changing how people think, how they approach situations like this. If you don't address the root of the problem, it'll just keep happening. The manager nodded quickly, his brow furrowed. You're absolutely right, he said. I'll make sure we address it at every level. Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the manager's face, searching for sincerity. After a long moment, he nodded once, a small but significant gesture. Good, he said simply. As Shaq finally boarded the plane, the murmurs in the terminal began to fade, replaced by the hum of engines starting up. Inside the jet, the atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. The flight attendant greeted him warmly, her smile genuine but professional. Welcome aboard, Mr. O'Neill, she said, gesturing toward the plush leather seats. We're honored to have you with us. Shaq gave her a polite nod, settling into one of the seats near the window. The cabin was spacious and luxurious, a far cry from the tension-filled terminal. But even as he leaned back, trying to let the soft hum of the engine soothe his frayed nerves, his mind refused to let go of what had happened. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Tapping it, he brought the phone to his ear, listening to the steady ring on the other end. Hey, he said when the call connected. I need to talk to you about something. The voice on the other end was familiar, warm, and slightly amused. Shaq, what's up? You sound serious. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his elbow resting on his knee as he spoke. Just had a situation at the airport, he said, his tone even. It's not the first time, and I'm tired of letting it slide. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. What happened? Shaq recounted the events in concise detail, his voice steady but laced with underlying frustration. When he finished, there was silence for a moment before the voice on the other end responded. Man, that's unacceptable, his friend said, his tone sharp. What do you want to do about it? Shaq leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. I want to make it a teachable moment, he said finally. Not just for the guard, but for everyone who was there. People need to see that this kind of behavior isn't okay and that it's not about who I am. It's about how we treat each other. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment before responding. I hear you, his friend said. Let's figure out a way to make it happen. As the call ended, Shaq felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This wasn't just about one incident or one person, it was about the bigger picture. About using his platform and his voice to spark change, even in the smallest moments. The plane began to taxi down the runway, the ground falling away as it lifted into the sky. Shaq gazed out the window, the world below growing smaller with each passing second. But his thoughts remained grounded, focused on the work that still needed to be done. The terminal had gone eerily quiet as the weight of Shaq's presence lingered, like the calm before a storm. Whispers continued to ripple through the staff, their collective anticipation hanging in the air. Somewhere near the back, the regional manager was still speaking rapidly into his phone, his tone frantic yet determined. Whatever gears had been set into motion, they were moving fast. Shaq stood calmly in the center of it all, a quiet force amidst the chaos. His composure was unshaken, but there was a subtle intensity in the way he carried himself now, as if the room itself was bending to his presence. He glanced at his watch, a small gesture that only heightened the tension. Every second felt heavy, stretching out like an eternity for those watching. And then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the terminal. Heads turned as a man in an impeccably tailored suit appeared, flanked by two equally polished assistants. His face was flushed, not from exertion but from a mix of embarrassment and dread. This was the airport's director, and his sudden appearance was no coincidence. "Mr. O'Neill," the director called out, his voice carrying a strained politeness as he approached Shaq with an outstretched hand. His expression was a strange mix of forced cheer and genuine panic. "It's an honor to have you here. I wasn't informed you'd be flying through our terminal today." Shaq turned slowly, his towering frame making the director pause mid-step. Shaq didn't take the offered hand right away. Instead, he regarded the man with a cool, measured gaze. "Didn't realize I needed to send out a memo," Shaq said, his tone calm but edged with something sharper. The director flinched, a faint sheen of sweat appearing on his brow. "Of course not, sir," he stammered. "This is entirely on us. I assure you, this situation will be handled immediately." Shaq tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Handled how?" he asked, his voice low but cutting. "By sweeping it under the rug? By pretending it didn't happen?" The director's face paled further, his composure beginning to crack. Before he could answer, Shaq gestured toward the security guard, who was now standing frozen, his earlier bravado drained away. The guard's eyes darted nervously between Shaq and the director, his posture rigid as if bracing for impact. "I just want to know one thing," Shaq said, his voice steady but resonant enough to command the room's attention. He turned fully to face the guard, his gaze piercing. "Why did you assume I didn't belong here?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap, the silence that followed almost deafening. The guard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face flushed a deep red as he stammered, searching for anything to say. I was just following protocol," the guard finally mumbled, his voice barely audible. Shaq arched an eyebrow, his expression unyielding. "Protocol," he repeated, his tone making it clear he wasn't buying the excuse. "What part of your protocol says to treat people like they're guilty until proven innocent?" The guard swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. The room seemed to shrink around him as the weight of his actions became undeniable. The staff, the director, and even the regional manager, all of them were watching, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disapproval. Before the guard could respond, another figure entered the scene, his presence immediately commanding attention. The airport CEO, a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority, strode into the terminal. His pace was brisk, his expression grim but composed. He made a beeline for Shaq, extending his hand without hesitation. "Shaquille," the CEO said, addressing him with a familiarity that surprised everyone present. "I came as soon as I heard. This should never have happened." Shaq shook the man's hand firmly, his demeanor softening just slightly. "Good to see you," Shaq replied, his voice calm but laced with a hint of irony. "Though I wish it were under better circumstances." The CEO nodded, his expression somber. He turned to the guard, his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. "You have no idea who you've been dealing with, do you?" he asked, his tone cold and unforgiving. The guard shook his head slowly, his face pale. I didn't realize." The CEO let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "No, you didn't," he said. "And that's the problem. This isn't just about a passenger. This is about one of our most important partners. Shaquille O'Neal isn't just flying with us, he's one of the key investors in this company." Gasps rippled through the crowd, the revelation hitting like a tidal wave. The staff exchanged wide-eyed glances, their earlier whispers now replaced with stunned silence. The guard's mouth fell open, his expression one of utter disbelief. "Investor," the guard croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, investor," the CEO confirmed, his tone sharp. "Without him, a lot of what you see here wouldn't exist. And instead of treating him with the respect he deserves, you chose to humiliate him." The guard looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. His earlier defiance was now completely gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Shaq raised a hand, stopping him. "It's not about who I am," Shaq said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about how you treat people, period. I don't need special treatment. I just want to be treated like anyone else deserves to be." The words hung heavy in the air, their weight undeniable. The guard's head dropped further, his shoulders sagging as the reality of his actions fully sank in. The CEO turned to Shaq, his expression earnest. "We'll make this right," he said. "Not just for today, but going forward. This company stands for more than this, and we'll make sure every single employee knows it." Shaq regarded the CEO for a moment before nodding. "Good," he said. "Because the next time this happens, I won't be so patient." With that, Shaq turned and walked away, his steps deliberate and unhurried. The room remained silent, the weight of what had just transpired settling over everyone present. For the staff, it was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that actions had consequences, and that respect was non-negotiable. As Shaq boarded his jet and settled into his seat, he felt a sense of closure. The situation had been resolved, but more importantly, a message had been sent. Sometimes, it wasn't about raising your voice or making a scene. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was stand firm, speak your truth, and let your actions do the talking. And in that moment, as the jet lifted into the sky, Shaquille O'Neal knew he had done just that. Here's the continuation to deepen the climax and deliver an even more impactful emotional resonance while staying true to the narrative. As Shaq's jet disappeared into the bright expanse of the sky, the tension inside the terminal lingered like the aftermath of a storm. The CEO remained standing, his sharp eyes trained on the now visibly shaken guard. The other staff members were frozen, unsure whether to step forward or retreat further into the background. It was clear that the scene wasn't over for them, far from it. The guard, his bravado now replaced with outright fear, tried to stammer an apology. I didn't mean any disrespect," he mumbled, his voice cracking. The CEO's gaze didn't waver. "Not meaning disrespect doesn't erase the disrespect you've shown," he said coldly. "Your actions spoke volumes, and what they said was that you judged a man not on his behavior, but on your assumptions." The regional manager, sensing an opportunity to redeem himself, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, I take full responsibility for my team's behavior," he said. "This doesn't reflect the values we uphold here at the airport." The CEO turned his attention to the manager, his expression softening just slightly. "Good," he said. "Because this situation isn't just about one man's poor judgment. It's about leadership. It's about setting an example and holding people accountable not only when things go wrong, but every day." The guard's head sank lower with each word. The staff watching from the sidelines exchanged uneasy glances. For some, the message was a wake-up call, for others, it was a harsh reminder of their own silent complicity. Miles away, in the air above the city, Shaq sat quietly in his jet, gazing out at the clouds. The events of the morning still lingered in his mind, but his focus was already shifting. He wasn't one to dwell, he was a man of action. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed. Tapping it, he waited for the call to connect. "Shaq," a voice answered, cheerful and familiar. It was one of his longtime business partners, someone who had been with him through countless ventures. "What's going on, big guy?" Shaq leaned back in his seat, his deep voice steady but tinged with purpose. "I need your help," he said. "Something happened today, and I think we can turn it into something bigger." The voice on the other end grew serious. "Tell me." Shaq explained the incident in detail, his words precise but carrying the weight of his frustration. He didn't embellish, he didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough. By the time he finished, there was silence on the other end. "Man," his partner finally said, "that's heavy. But knowing you, you've got an idea." Shaq smiled faintly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Yeah," he said. "This isn't just about me. It's about anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. I want to work with the airport, with the company, and make sure this doesn't happen again to anyone." There was a pause, then the voice on the other end replied, "I'm in. Whatever you need." Back on the ground, the airport's leadership wasted no time. By the following week, an email was sent out to every employee, mandatory diversity and inclusion training effective immediately. The training sessions were comprehensive, designed to challenge biases and encourage empathy. But it didn't stop there. Shaq's name carried weight, and the story of what had happened quickly spread beyond the confines of the airport. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a cautionary tale and a call to action. Interviews followed, with Shaq sharing his perspective not as a celebrity, but as a man who had experienced what so many others had. "This isn't about me," he said during one televised appearance. "This is about how we see each other. It's about understanding that respect isn't something you earn because of your status or your wealth, it's something everyone deserves, no matter who they are." His words struck a chord, sparking conversations in workplaces, schools, and homes across the country. Social media lit up with hashtags like #RespectEveryone and #BeyondAssumptions, and stories of similar experiences began pouring in. Shaq's calm but powerful stance had inspired others to speak up, to challenge the status quo. Weeks later, Shaq returned to the same airport, this time for another business trip. The terminal looked the same, but the atmosphere was different. There was a buzz of anticipation among the staff, who had all undergone the new training program. For some, the experience had been uncomfortable, for others, it had been transformative. As Shaq approached the private gate, he noticed familiar faces: the regional manager, the young woman with the clipboard, and even the guard. This time, however, their expressions were different. The guard in particular looked humbled, his demeanor quiet but sincere. "Mr. O'Neill," the guard said as Shaq stopped in front of him. I want to apologize again. I've spent the past few weeks thinking about what happened, and I realize now how wrong I was. I'm truly sorry." Shaq studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, with a nod, he extended his hand. "It's not about saying sorry," Shaq said as the guard shook his hand hesitantly. "It's about learning and doing better. That's what matters." The guard nodded, his eyes earnest. "I understand. And I'll keep trying." As Shaq boarded his jet once again, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. What had started as a moment of frustration had turned into something far greater. It wasn't about punishing one person, it was about creating change, about showing that even in the face of prejudice, grace and determination could prevail. And as the jet soared into the sky, Shaq knew that this was just the beginning. The ripples of that one moment would continue to spread, reaching people far beyond that small airport terminal. Sometimes, the biggest changes started with the smallest actions. And in that quiet realization, Shaquille O'Neal found his victory. The tension in the terminal had shifted. What had started as a confrontation now hung in the air as a powerful moment of reflection. The guard, his face pale and shoulders slumped, was quietly escorted away by security. No words were exchanged between him and Shaq, there was no need for them. The consequences were clear. In the moments that followed, the staff of the airport remained silent, still processing the unexpected turn of events. Shaq stood there, a quiet but undeniable force. His calm presence, coupled with the gravity of the situation, commanded respect without a single harsh word or dramatic gesture. The regional manager, still visibly shaken, glanced toward the ground, clearly avoiding eye contact with Shaq. No one dared challenge what had just unfolded. No one could. Shaq took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. This was not about power or humiliation. This was about something far deeper. He turned to address the remaining staff, his voice steady, filled with an undeniable sense of purpose. "Let this be a lesson," Shaq said, his tone both firm and compassionate. "Respect shouldn't depend on what someone looks like or what you think you know about them. It shouldn't depend on their race, their status, or the way they carry themselves. It should come from within, and it should be given freely to every person, no matter who they are." There was a long pause as the words settled over the room. The staff had never heard a message quite like this before, one that wasn't filled with anger or bitterness, but one that spoke directly to the heart of what had just transpired. In the silence, a realization began to spread. They had seen Shaq's grace under pressure. They had witnessed his strength, not in his size or fame, but in his response to an unjust situation. One by one, the employees began to nod, some with small, quiet smiles. Others stood with their hands at their sides, taking in the words as if they were being changed in real time. And then, without warning, a few of them started to clap softly at first, then with more confidence, until the entire room was filled with the sound of respectful applause. Shaq stood there, unmoving, accepting their acknowledgement without seeking it. He didn't raise his arms in triumph, nor did he offer a self-congratulatory smile. His demeanor remained calm, almost meditative. He was not here to prove anything. His actions had already spoken louder than any applause ever could. He gave the room one final, steady glance, then nodded respectfully to the staff. He knew this was a moment they would not forget. It was a moment that had started with a misunderstanding, but it would end with lasting change. Without another word, Shaq turned toward the jet that awaited him on the tarmac. His long strides were deliberate, measured. As he walked, he felt the weight of what had just unfolded. In that brief encounter, he had taken a stand for something greater than himself. He had shown the power of dignity in the face of adversity. He had reclaimed not only his respect but had instilled in others the importance of giving that respect freely. Shaq didn't look back as he boarded his private jet. The sound of the door closing behind him was the only sound that followed him into the cabin. Inside, everything was already in place. His assistant, who had been with him for years, greeted him with a nod. "Everything good, Shaq?" the assistant asked as Shaq settled into his seat. Shaq nodded. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady but filled with a sense of calm satisfaction. "It's all good." The jet began to roll down the runway, the engines humming as they gathered speed. Shaq leaned back in his seat, his eyes briefly closing as he allowed himself a moment of peace. He didn't need to bask in the glory of what had just happened. He wasn't interested in praise or public recognition. His actions had already made an impact. In the background, the assistant continued to organize a few papers, occasionally glancing up at Shaq. After a few minutes, the assistant asked cautiously, "Do you think they'll learn from this?" "The people at the airport." Shaq opened his eyes and turned to look at his assistant, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "I think they will," he said softly. "It's about how you handle yourself in the toughest situations. People notice that." The jet ascended higher into the sky, the city below growing smaller and smaller. For Shaq, the day was over, but the ripple effect of what had happened was only just beginning. He knew that the lesson he had taught today would resonate far beyond this one terminal. It wasn't just about what had happened with the guard, it was about what could happen when someone chose to stand up for what's right with dignity and respect. As Shaq's jet flew across the country, the story of what had happened at the airport continued to spread. News outlets reported it, with a focus not on the confrontation itself, but on Shaq's calm, composed response to injustice. His words about respect and equality echoed in articles, interviews, and even social media posts. People from all walks of life began to share their own stories of prejudice and mistreatment, inspired by Shaq's example. In the coming weeks, Shaq received messages of gratitude from all over the world. People thanked him for his example of patience and strength. Many of them shared how they had faced similar situations and how Shaq's actions had given them the courage to stand up for themselves. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes, the smallest actions standing firm in the face of injustice, choosing to remain calm in a storm can create waves of change. At the airport, the guard's fate was sealed. He was placed on probation and required to undergo extensive diversity and inclusion training. The airport also made a public statement, acknowledging the mistake and promising to do better moving forward. The regional manager, who had been quick to apologize, continued to work diligently to ensure that the airport staff embraced a more inclusive and respectful culture. In the days that followed, Shaq's story became an inspiration not only to those who admired him for his basketball career but to anyone who had ever felt belittled or unfairly judged. His actions had proven that it wasn't about how powerful or famous you were, it was about how you chose to carry yourself. As Shaq reflected on the events that had transpired, he knew that this wasn't just about winning. It was about something much deeper. Respect, dignity, and the power of showing up with grace in the face of adversity. The consequences had been clear. The guard had faced disciplinary action, and the airport had taken steps to correct its course. But the greater justice wasn't in what had happened to the antagonist. It was in the impact that Shaq's response had on the people around him, on the lessons that would stay with them long after the applause had faded. Shaq's quiet strength had spoken volumes. He didn't seek revenge or make demands. He simply asked for respect that was based on the shared humanity in all of us. And in doing so, he had reclaimed not just his own dignity, but had helped others reclaim theirs as well. In the end, the lesson was simple: true power lies not in dominance, but in the strength to stand up for what is right, with humility, integrity, and grace. Shaquille O'Neal had proven that without a doubt. As Shaquille O'Neal's jet soared into the sky, the events of that day seemed to settle into something deeper, something more profound. From the moment he had stepped into that terminal, what had seemed like a simple airport encounter had turned into a moment of reflection for everyone involved. It wasn't just about the confrontation with the guard, it was about the bigger picture. It was about something that many people needed to be reminded of, something we often forget in our busy, fast-paced lives. In a world where assumptions can so easily blind us to the truth, Shaquille O'Neal had shown everyone something powerful. He had proven that respect isn't given because of a title, wealth, or how much someone is admired. Respect is earned through the way we treat others, how we show dignity in moments of difficulty, and how we stand up for what's right. It's not about how tall you stand physically, but about the character you carry with you. Shaq could have reacted differently. He could have let anger take control. He could have raised his voice, demanded answers, and sought to publicly embarrass the guard. But instead, he chose a path of quiet strength. He chose to handle the situation with grace and dignity, refusing to stoop to a level of disrespect, even when he was being unfairly judged. And in doing so, he became a living example of the power of staying calm in the face of adversity. That moment at the airport wasn't just about a misunderstanding or even about making the guard see the error of his ways. It was a lesson for everyone who witnessed it, a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference in the way we respond to situations. When life challenges us, when others treat us unfairly, it's not about what happens to us, but about how we choose to react. And through that reaction, we can set an example for others to follow. There's something profound about how we respond to adversity. The world often tries to force us into labels, into categories, into ideas that are shaped by prejudice and assumption. But Shaq's response showed that none of that matters. What matters is the strength of your character and the grace with which you handle the situations that come your way. When you stand firm in your values, when you remain calm in the face of insult, you not only reclaim your respect, but you also show others how to rise above negativity. As people all around the world watched this story unfold, something clicked. It wasn't just about Shaq anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or looked down upon because of the way they looked, where they came from, or what others assumed about them. Shaq had used his platform to show them that they too could handle difficult situations with the same strength, that they too could rise above unfairness with dignity. In our world today, it's easy to get caught up in the rush of life, to react in anger when we're wronged, or to let others define our worth. We're surrounded by labels, judgments, and stereotypes. But in those moments, it's essential to remember what Shaquille O'Neal taught us that day: our true worth is not determined by how others see us. It's determined by how we see ourselves, how we choose to carry ourselves, and how we treat others, regardless of who they are or where they come from. In a world full of noise, where it's tempting to fight back with equal force when wronged, Shaq showed us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to stay calm, stand tall, and treat others with the same respect we expect in return. When we do that, we not only raise ourselves but also help raise everyone around us. The truth is, respect isn't a one-way street. It's something we give and receive. And in a world that sometimes forgets this simple truth, it's up to each of us to lead by example, just as Shaquille O'Neal did. We all have the potential to be strong, to be dignified, and to be examples of what true power looks like, power that isn't about intimidation, but about kindness, respect, and self-control. It's about the ability to walk away from unnecessary conflict, to stand firm in the face of unfairness, and to treat everyone, no matter who they are, with the dignity they deserve. Shaq didn't need to prove his worth. He didn't need to shout it from the rooftops or make sure everyone knew who he was. His actions spoke louder than any words could. And by simply being himself, calm, dignified, and gracious, he reminded everyone that no one is above respect. Not because of their fame, their money, or their status, but because of who they are as a person. For all of us, there is a lesson in that moment. It's a reminder that we all have the power to choose how we respond to life's challenges. We have the power to show grace, even when others don't deserve it. We have the power to stand tall without arrogance, to speak up for what's right without belittling others. We have the power to be the change we want to see in the world. And sometimes, it takes one person, one moment of calm strength, to remind everyone of what true respect really looks like. Shaquille O'Neal's actions at that airport didn't just change the course of his own day, they changed the course of how many people thought about respect, power, and dignity. They reminded us all that no matter how big or small, how famous or unknown, we all have the ability to stand tall and show the world what we're truly made of. And in doing so, we inspire others to do the same. In the end, that's what makes the greatest impact, not how we react in moments of comfort, but how we handle ourselves when the world challenges us. True power lies not in how loud we are or how much we have, but in our ability to maintain our integrity and treat others with the kindness and respect they deserve, regardless of the situation. So, as you go about your day, remember this lesson: when life tests you, when others judge you or doubt you, you have the power to rise above it. And in doing so, you become an example of what it means to truly respect others and yourself. Just as Shaquille O'Neal showed the world, the greatest strength isn't in taking what's yours, it's in knowing when to stand firm, speak with dignity, and walk away with grace.